This week, we're going to talk about common sentence errors or common mistakes that students often make. And this first video is going to be about sentence fragments. The second video in this series will talk about run-on sentences. So let's get into it and talk about what is a sentence fragment, and then how do we correct them, or how do we make sure that we avoid them. Well, first off, a sentence fragment is not a complete sentence. It may include a subject, it may even include a verb, but it is never a complete thought. Let's start by thinking about what is a simple sentence, what makes a sentence, and then we can make sure that we have all those parts in order to avoid writing fragments. As we've talked about in previous weeks, a simple sentence includes a subject and a verb. That is, a person, place, or thing that is doing an action. And those two things together equal a complete thought. So on this page, you'll see three examples of simple sentences. We have the students studied. In this case, students is the subject. It is the person, place, or thing that is doing the action, and the action is to study. The second sentence, the students studied narrative essays, is still a simple sentence. We still have the subject of students. We still have the verb of studied, but now we have a direct object. The sentence is a little bit more descriptive. We have not just a verb, but we have a verb and a verb phrase, and we call those two things together a predicate. The last sentence is also an example of a simple sentence. We have one subject, one verb, but again, a little bit more detail in the sentence. The students studied narrative essays, including Why I Own a Gun by Gillian Weiss. So there are some ways to figure out whether or not we have a sentence fragment on our hands. The first thing is we want to figure out, is there a subject missing? So if you take a look at the example on the screen, ran to the store faster than a rabbit. Well, who ran? We're missing the subject or the actor in that sentence. Sometimes we can ask whether or not the sentence is missing a verb, or if the verb is in the wrong form. For example, my favorite history teacher. Well, in this case, we have a subject, but there is no action. What did the favorite history teacher do, or not do, or say? So we're missing the verb in this example. Sometimes a sentence fragment is a leftover phrase, meaning it's maybe part of the end of a predicate that got lopped off for some reason. So we look at the example on the screen, for better or for worse. Well, what is for better or for worse? What is it modifying? And sometimes a sentence fragment will come in the form of what we call an abandoned clause. An example of abandoned clause is when my mother married my father. We know that's an abandoned clause if we think back to what makes a complex sentence, because it begins with a subordinating conjunction. We have to ask ourselves, well, what happened when my mother married my father? So that is, again, not a complete thought. And then finally, the misuse of words like such as, for example, and especially. An example of the incorrect use of this would be, such as, my brother was practicing martial arts. We don't know. It's unclear, did something happen when my brother was practicing martial arts? So the such as, where it's unclear what it's modifying. So another way to figure out if you have a sentence fragment on our hands is, here's a flow chart that you'll find in your Rules for Writers textbook. We can ask ourselves first if there's a verb. If there's no verb, then we know, of course, it's a sentence fragment. If there is a verb, we want to move on and ask ourselves, well, is there a subject that is doing the action or doing the verb? And if the answer is no, we again have a fragment on our hands. Finally, we can ask if is the word group merely a subordinating clause, meaning it begins with a word like such as, or because, or when, and if that is the case, it's also a fragment. And if you answered no to that last question, then what you have is a sentence on your hands. There are three ways to correct sentence fragments. The first way is to combine it with nearby sentences. Most often when we write sentence fragments, we're writing them in paragraphs, and what's happening is that we're accidentally separating one part of a sentence from another. So let's look at some incorrect examples and then look at how to correct them. So an incorrect example would be, I forgot to eat breakfast, period, on the morning of my driver's test, period. Well, that first sentence actually is a simple sentence. We have a subject, which is I, and a verb, which is forgot. And then we have the rest of the action that describes what was forgotten. However, that second sentence, on the morning of my driver's test, we really have no subject and we really have no verb. What we have is just a clause that tells us when the action is taking place, but we're missing the subject and we're missing the verb. To correct that, we can simply combine those two sentences together, and now we have a complete sentence on our hands. I forgot to eat breakfast on the morning of my driver's test, which probably means you didn't do so well. Here's another example. If the front door is locked, period, use the back entrance. Well, in this case, the first sentence is not a complete sentence. The reason it's not a complete sentence is because it begins with the word if. And thinking back to our lesson on complex sentences, if is an example of a subordinating conjunction. And whenever a group of words begins with a subordinating conjunction, it means that you have what's called a dependent clause on your hands, and it must be attached to a simple sentence or an independent clause. We can simply fix this by replacing the period in the middle and with a comma, and now we have, if the front door is locked, comma, use the back entrance. So the first line of defense against sentence fragments is to take a look and see if you can combine the fragment with anything that is nearby that would also make sense as a complete sentence. Another way to fix a sentence fragment is to simply revise it. We can revise a sentence fragment by just adding what's missing. You can add the missing subject, you can add the missing verb, or if it's the complete thought that's missing, you can revise it to add the complete thought. So here are some examples. The incorrect example is, loves to lie around in the sun all day. Well, in this case, we have a verb, loves, or the verb phrase loves to lie, and we have a descriptive part of the predicate, but we're missing the subject. We don't know who is doing the lying or who is doing the loving. And so to correct that sentence, we need to add a subject to it. And the corrected version reads, my roommate's pug loves to lie around in the sun all day. My roommate's pug, or her dog, is now the subject of the sentence. A second example reads, Joe to train every day. Okay, well in this case, we're actually missing a verb. To train is a verb, but it's not in the right form. So we have to revise that in order to correct it. So we can correct that as Joe trains every day for the marathon next week, or simply Joe trains every day would be fine. Or Joe is training every day for the marathon next month. Two ways to put the verb in the correct form, therefore fixing the fragment. A final way that you can correct a sentence fragment is to just rewrite the fragment or the entire passage that contains the fragment. So here's an incorrect example. Our landlord was expected to make changes, such as fixing the plumbing, installing a new washer, and replacing the security gate. He has not done any of it yet, and weeks have passed. Well, in this case, our first sentence, our landlord was expected to make changes, that's a complete sentence. We have our subject, which is landlord, and our verb, which is was expected, and then we have the complete thought. Also, the third sentence is a complete sentence. It is not a complete sentence. That one is missing a subject. Okay, so how are we going to fix this? We can combine some of these sentences, and then in other cases we can add a subject, or we can simply revise the passage completely so that it reads a little bit differently. So let's read the corrected version together. Our landlord was expected to make changes, such as fixing the plumbing, installing a new washer, and replacing the security gate lock. Weeks have passed, and he still has not done any of it yet. So in the first two sentences, we've combined them to fix the fragment. And in the third one, we've added a phrase that lets us know when the action is happening, weeks have passed, and he has still not done anything yet. We've added a subject. And so this is actually a compound sentence in the end. If you feel like you have a good handle on sentence fragments, you can stop the video now and move forward to take a look at run-on sentences, and then of course take the quiz. If you're still having a little bit of a hard time, the next set of slides is going to take you through the examples that are in your Rules for Writers textbook. I would also encourage you to read the Rules for Writers textbook as well, because you're going to get useful information that will help you to correct sentence fragments there. So let's move forward and jump into it for those of you who'd like to continue on. Okay, so we already talked about how repairing sentence fragments, the best way to do it is to pull it into a nearby sentence, meaning combine it with the sentences that are nearby. Here are some more examples. We had just sat down to dinner, period, when the cat leaped onto the table. In this case, we had just sat down for dinner is a simple sentence. There's nothing wrong with it. We have a subject, we, and then we have a verb phrase, had just sat, and then the predicate which describes where the sitting and when the sitting was done. But the second sentence begins with the word one, and one is when, and when is a subordinating conjunction. So we can combine that sentence with the one that comes before it. What we do is get rid of the period, lowercase the when, and then we have a complex sentence on our hand. No comma is needed in this case because the when, or the subordinating conjunction, is coming in the second half of the sentence. Here are some other examples. Is often hot and humid during summer. In this case, we're missing a subject. So we need to add the subject into the sentence in order to fix the fragment. Simply, we can add the word it. It is often hot and humid during the summer. In example number 2, we're missing the verb. Students are usually very busy at the end of the semester writing papers and taking exams. Students is the subject, but we were initially missing the action word, or in this case, the verb is a linking verb, are. So we just need to add that in. Talking about subordinating clauses, this is oftentimes a confusing set of words that will set us up to accidentally write sentence fragments. So we remember that subordinating conjunctions are words that we use to write complex sentences, and on the screen before you are a list of them. Whenever you use one of these words before a subject and a verb, what you're doing is creating a dependent clause. And we must combine all dependent clauses with independent clauses. So for example, if I wrote, although I did my homework, period, that's not a complete sentence. I can say, although I did my homework, comma, I turned it in late, and in that case, it is a complete sentence. So we want to be careful for any time that we see these subordinating conjunctions because they create what's called dependent clauses. So let's take a look at how to fix some of these sentences that begin with subordinating conjunctions. Americans have come to fear the West Nile virus, period, because it was transmitted by the common mosquito. The first sentence is fine. Americans is your subject, have come to fear is your verb phrase, and then we get the rest of the information that completes the thought. But the second sentence, because it begins with the word because, which is a subordinating conjunction, it creates a dependent clause, and therefore is a sentence fragment. In this case, the textbook is telling us to combine the sentence, so we can just get rid of the period, lowercase the b and because, and add lowercase the b and because, and we're all set. In the second example, although psychiatrist Peter Kramer expresses concerns about Prozac, period, many other doctors believe that the benefits of antidepressants outweigh the risk. Well, in this case, the first sentence is the fragment, and the second one is okay. The first sentence begins with the word although, which is a subordinating conjunction. Although psychiatrist Peter Kramer expresses concerns about Prozac, well, what about although? We haven't answered that condition. And so the best way to correct that sentence is to lowercase the m in many, and this time add a comma. The reason we're adding a comma in sentence number 2, and we didn't add a comma in sentence number 1, is because in sentence number 2, the dependent clause comes first in the sentence. And so whenever the dependent clause comes first, we must add a comma. And just to repeat myself again, we know we have a dependent clause on our hands because the group of words has begun with a subordinating conjunction. And you can refer back to the previous slide or to Blackboard where you'll find a list of those subordinating conjunctions. Sometimes a fragmented clause cannot be attached easily to a nearby sentence, or attaching it maybe creates a kind of awkward feeling. So what we can do then is we can turn the clause into a sentence, and sometimes the simplest way to do that is not to add, but to delete. So if we look at the example on the screen, uncontrolled development is taking toll on the environment, so that across the globe, fragile ecosystems are collapsing. The first sentence is a complete sentence. There's nothing wrong with it. It has a subject and a verb, and it's a complete thought. However, we never want to begin a sentence with the word so, and especially not like so that. What that so is a coordinating conjunction, and it's used to combine two simple sentences, but never to start a simple sentence. So we can fix that by just beginning the sentence with the word across, and now we have a complex sentence on our hand. Across the globe, comma, fragile ecosystems are collapsing. Sometimes fragments appear as phrases. A phrase can be a subordinate clause, like we talked about the examples of sentences that start with although or because or if. But what phrases do is they function within a sentence as adjectives, which describe nouns, adverbs, which describe verbs, or sometimes just as nouns themselves. But they can't stand alone. They're not sentences. Fragmented phrases are oftentimes prepositional or verbal phrases. Prepositional phrases show us how or when something took place. Sometimes there are appositives. Those are groups of words that will rename or give more information about a noun or a pronoun. So let's take a look at an example. The archaeologists worked slowly, period, examining and labeling every pottery shard they uncovered. Well, examining and labeling every pottery shard they uncovered is a phrase. It's not a complete sentence. And so in this case, the textbook is telling us to lowercase the e in examining and combine that sentence with the sentence that comes before it by lopping off the period and adding a comma. If a fragmented phrase cannot be pulled into a nearby sentence effectively, we can turn that phrase into a sentence, and we can usually do that by adding what's missing. We're going to add a subject, we're going to add a verb, or both if they're both missing. So let's take a look at the example on the screen now. Jamie explained how to access our new database, also how to submit expense reports and request vendor payments. Well, in this case, combining the second sentence with the first one would create a long and wordy sentence. So we're going to keep them as separate. But this time we're going to add in a subject, she, and a verb, taught. So we're not just beginning with how to submit expense reports, but we're having that subject and the verb that are telling us who is doing the acting, what is the acting, and then we have the rest of the verb phrase that explains what kind of action is taking place. So we are going to talk also about parts of a compound predicate. A predicate is just another word for a verb and a verb phrase. So it could be a verb, it could be a direct object, it could be complements or modifiers. All of these things are to say the verb is the action, and the rest of the things that exist in the predicate tell us where the action took place, how it took place, when it took place, or who it took place to. A compound predicate includes two or more predicates joined with a coordinating conjunction. These are our fanboys words: and, but, so, because, and, but, so, yet, etc. Because parts of a compound predicate have the same subject, they should appear in the same sentence. So here's our example. The woodpecker finch carefully selects a twig of a certain size and shape, period, and then uses this tool to pry grubs from trees. Okay, so here's what I mean by this. We have a compound predicate, meaning we have one subject, which is the woodpecker, and then we have the verb selects, and then we have a second verb, uses. The woodpecker is doing the action both in the first predicate and in the second predicate. And so we want to make sure that that second half of the sentence doesn't get lopped off by itself, but that we combine the two. And so we're going to do that by lowercasing, getting rid of the period, and lowercasing the a and. In this case, you don't need a comma because we're not writing a compound sentence. A compound sentence would be subject, predicate, plus new subject, predicate, but instead we only have one subject and yet two actions. So no comma is needed in this case. Another example where oftentimes fragments are accidentally written is when we're writing lists. Sometimes we'll accidentally lop off the end of a list and separate it from the subject and the verb that introduces the list. So here's an example. It has been said that there are only 3 indigenous American art forms, period. Musical comedy, jazz, and soap opera. Well, in this case, musical comedy, jazz, and soap opera are listed items that help to illustrate or explain the action that has taken place in the first part of the sentence. So instead of having a period, we want to include a colon, and then we want to lowercase the M in musical, musical comedy, jazz, and soap opera. So those 3 items in the list are now included as part of the sentence. To just have the words musical comedy, jazz, and soap opera by themselves is not a complete sentence. They're just a group of nouns, right? It's a list of 3 nouns, but they're completely disconnected from the other information in the sentence. Creating a list can be especially tricky when we're using words like to introduce examples, words like especially or namely or like or such as. These are words that oftentimes introduce lists, but we can accidentally separate those lists from the main action of the sentence. So here's an example. In the 20th century, the South produced some great American writers, period, such as Flannery O'Connor, William Faulkner, Alice Walker, one of my favorites, and Tennessee Williams. In this case, such as should not be its own sentence. There is no subject and there is no verb in that second sentence. And so what we need to do is, instead of using the colon this time, is get rid of the period, add a comma, a lowercase the s in such, and so now we are combining those 2 sentences. I apologize about the lawnmower that's going on outside. Okay, next steps. If you need to go back and revisit the information in this video, please rewatch it. You can also read the chapter on sentence fragments in your Rules for Writers textbook. Next steps are to watch the video on sentence fragments and get ready to take the quiz on Blackboard. Bye for now.